So as has been mentioned, we are in the middle of our Lenten sermon series based on Eric Elnes's book, The Gifts of the Dark Wood. And as we've already explored the gifts of uncertainty, the gifts of emptiness, the gifts of being thunderstruck, today we find ourselves exploring the gift of getting lost. Many of us have gotten lost, physically of course, but there's also emotional being lost and spiritual being lost as well. And as I was thinking about being physically lost, I can tell you that I do not like it very much. I especially do not like it when it's night and I'm in my car and I'm driving on a New Jersey highway and I miss my jugular turn and then I end up somewhere I don't wish to be, and my GPS battery has either died or dropped its signal. At that moment, my husband gets a phone call. Please tell me where I am and help me get back. Getting lost is disorienting, it's uncomfortable, and it's not very fun. When I think about getting physically lost, it's not like the good old days when we're driving and we had a map. The GPS is wonderful, but a map was paper. We could look and find ourselves on the map. If we were on a road trip or we were out and about somewhere, we'd pull over to the side of the road. Once you found yourself on the map, there was assurance that you weren't really lost at all. You could navigate, find a different exit, find a road, find a highway, and be back on your path rather quickly. Life is like driving at night without a GPS, with a broken battery or a lost signal. It throws us curveballs unexpectedly and zigs and zags and is never quite the straight path that we hope for, that we long for, and that we expect. It can feel a lot like we are disoriented with nowhere to go. Sometimes, of course, life takes us in an opposite direction of where we might think that we're going. And I suspect most of us, as we navigate through the ups and downs, the zigs, the zags, the unexpected exits, we would likely be fine with all of these twists and turns experiences if someone had given us that map for life. If we had the assurance that we could find ourselves on that paper and find our new way. Have you ever been lost in a new country, not just physically, but culturally as well? Or been to a country where you didn't speak the language and had to figure out how to get along? Being lost is not just being physically lost. And in preparation for today's sermon, I was reminded of when I lived in San Diego a number of years ago, we were working with refugees from Sudan. They were literally called the Lost Boys. You might remember this from the late 90s and early 2000s. They had been displaced from their country due to terrible war. They were orphaned, and they ended up at the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. Our job in working with a sister organization with the church was to help these folks, these young boys, mostly teenagers, navigate and live and get settled in San Diego. And I'll never forget one of the volunteers who said her job was to walk them through the grocery store, to help them recognize that the blue liquid in a spray bottle was Windex and not something that they were supposed to drink. We can be so disoriented even in our own culture, but we imagine what our fellow brothers and sisters who've come to this place experience on a daily basis. And I think of the refugees, the Syrian family in the raft dinner that's coming up in April, and Mary Jo Freebody will be in the narthex today selling tickets for that event. A Syrian family, the mother is going to be making for us a Middle Eastern meal to share her culture with us. And I think about how Abby and how Donna Dykstra went with her to show her how to use the bus system. A different culture, a different experience. Sometimes we can be lost in not knowing and understanding those things around us. Sometimes when we can be lost when we feel like we're stuck in the middle of this thing called dark wood that we've been exploring, and it just feels dark, and that there's no navigation system in front of us. Because the common denominator, I think, when we feel lost is that God feels absent. I think if we drill it down to the core, we feel like we are ultimately and utterly alone, and God is absent. I think about the times where faith, the foundation of faith, doesn't even hold up for folks sometimes, because whether it's slowly or whether it's dramatically, that faith is shattered, and what used to feel true and what used to be known is no longer sufficient. Sometimes we are spiritually lost and find ourselves wondering why faith doesn't make sense anymore. We know the human experiences that bring us to this place. Of course, the death of a loved one, having to find a new job where that old identity of who you were in that position no longer serves you. I think of new parents who are up all night with their beautiful baby that they cherish and love, and who think, I'm never going to sleep again, and I'm functioning on such a thin thread. Or perhaps the empty nesters whose children have gone off to college and are no longer in the home, and there's an awareness that they no longer know one another as spouses. Sometimes being lost can be one of these experiences in our life that is so dramatic that we can't help but cry out to God like the psalmist did. Of course, there's benign times of getting lost too, which you can imagine as well. Being lost can feel as simple and mundane as being stuck, not having an opportunity to know what is coming next. Nothing's really changing, but you long for something more. Author and Episcopal priest and professor Barbara Brown Taylor describes being lost as circumstances that you do not expect and that you don't plan. She shares her own story and says, I set out to be married, and I got divorced. I ate really healthy, and I got sick. I wanted to live in one place, and I ended up in a completely different part of the country and in a different state. No matter what the circumstance is, whenever we feel lost, it is disorienting, and it's hard to imagine that getting lost is truly a gift. But our faith tradition assures us that when we are lost, we can be found. Over and over again, we turn back to our scriptures, to our spiritual disciplines of prayer, to our fellow travelers along the way who have been lost and who are found and can remind us in those moments of darkness that we too are found. They can help us along the way. Taylor says, God does some of God's best work with people who are truly lost. I can tell you, when I've been in that lost place, I was not expecting nor hoping that God was doing God's best work in that time of being lost. Perhaps you can relate. Being lost is never comfortable for us. Let's remember from Scripture Sarah and Abraham, who were not spiritual giants, but they were ordinary people who had willing hearts to say yes to God without having that roadmap in front of them. Essentially, they consented to getting lost and set off on a life-changing journey with only God's promise to be with them. And the Hebrews, of course, under Pharaoh's rule, were enslaved and cried out over and over again to God. And then God sent Moses to lead them out of Egypt. And they wandered 40 years being lost. But in that time, God also strengthened them. And during those time in the wilderness, God never left them alone. Jesus, of course, had his own wilderness experience that we remember these 40 days of Lent. An experience of being lost when he spent those days in the desert being tempted by the devil. And it was only after those 40 days of preparation that his public ministry began, and he was prepared for that journey ahead. In the psalm today, we recognize that it shares cries of isolation and doubt and anguish, the feelings that take us over when we feel lost. Today's psalm describes our yearning for God and our desire for help in distress, even when others around us and even when we ourselves ask, where is God? A familiar refrain throughout the Psalms, where is God? Feeling lost is when God feels absent. God appears absent when our souls are cast down, when, like a deer searching for water, our soul longs for that nourishment and restoration. And our hope remains in God's promise and in the possibility, the sheer possibility that we may encounter God's presence once again. Friends, you know this, that sometimes in life we're required to trust the path in front of us, even when our GPS system has short-circuited. We are to live by hope in our faith that is unseen. And it's not pie-in-the-sky hope that these dreams are going to come true or that we can just pretend. This hope rests in the awareness that God's still small voice is still speaking today, and that God's providence is at work even when we do not see it. The psalmist today laments and then remembers. And like the psalmist, perhaps we too can remember that when we feel lost in the heart of the dark wood, we are never outside of God's bounds, of God's unfailing love and presence. The psalmist reminds himself of his own belovedness and then worships God even while experiencing despair. Because our souls long for this connection with our Creator and our Redeemer, and worship is a way that we connect with God. He says, by day the Lord commands his steadfast love. That's the reminder. And at night his song is with me. That's the personal connection. Our souls long at a deeper level to connect, and the psalmist knew this too. When he proclaims, the deer longs for flowing streams, so my soul longs for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, the living God. Proclamation, when shall I come and behold the face of God? The gift of getting lost is that we begin to pay a little bit more attention than we normally do to our circumstances and to our surroundings. Our senses are heightened if we take a moment to pay attention. We become more awake. Perhaps our eyes are open and we're looking for more blatant road signs and exit signs or billboards. But perhaps what we should be doing instead is looking for the subtle nudges the Spirit has been giving to us all along. For when we are lost, we can be found. Victoria Price is an author and a speaker and an artist who says this about being lost and found. And she actually gave up her career to become homeless to intentionally be lost and intentionally be uncomfortable to see what it was she could discover. Here's what she says. So how do we get to this place of being lost enough to start becoming found? That's our desire, right? To be found. Well, that's why it's called the way of being lost. You can't plan it. It just happens, usually when you least expect it. When it does, you realize that there really is only one way to go, forward into the seemingly complete unknown, where we finally, and seemingly miraculously, discover the courage to hear what we've been too terrified to admit. I am lost. From there, from that place that none of us ever aspires to be, but which we will come forward to discover, is the hopeful and healing embarkment point for all fundamental transformation. The rubber finally meets the road. At last, we find ourselves on the beautiful but bumpy, healing but hard, radical but redemptive way of being lost. This week, if you're feeling in the middle of the dark wood, if you're feeling lost, I invite you to take some time to get quiet, to open wide your senses and try to connect with God's created world. As the poem on the front of your bulletin suggests, David Wagner eloquently describes what to do when we find ourselves lost. Stand still. The tree ahead and bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are called is here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger, must ask permission to know it and be known. The forest breathes. Listen, it answers. I have made this place around you. If you leave it, you may come back again, saying, here. No two trees are the same to raven. No two branches are the same to wren. If what a tree or bush does is lost on you, you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. Elise so beautifully described the essence of Camp Johnsonburg to get an hour away from us here in Ridgewood in Bergen County and to experience creation in a new way, young and old alike. Something happens when we're in the wilderness, literally. We put our phones away, we put the distractions away, and we have a chance to touch and to connect and to see God's creation if we're open to it and open our eyes. When we feel lost, let us remember that the trees are not lost. The blooms under the snow that are trying to emerge even today, that were planted back in November, are not lost. There is good and created order all around us, and may this assurance be an anchor to you and hold you steadfast as you continue the journey in the dark wood. And if you're not feeling lost this week, I invite you to get lost. How about you take some time to intentionally get lost? Take a different route home from church today. Our culture, we're such creatures of habits. We go the same way, we take the same turn, we follow the same path. Go a different way home today. Mark was telling me about one of his spiritual teachers who's now deceased, who intentionally went to a forest to get lost and spend time there, because he said when he was there, he discovered new things. Take a different way home today and see what you might discover that has been right in front of you that you've been missing. Take a walk. Find yourself in a different neighborhood. Park your car 10, 12, another town away. Get lost. See what you can discover and experience in a new place, in a new surroundings. What gentle nudge might God be trying to give to you that when you're not lost, you don't hear? Notice God's creations and sights and smells and noises. Get disoriented and see what God might be there to teach you or to show you. And remember that when you are lost, you can always be found. And if you've been through the lost experience and are on the other side, know that your story will impact someone else, and pay attention. Pay attention to how you might be a light journeying along with someone else who may today find themselves in the dark wood. And remember that God does some of God's best work with those who have been, who are, and who will be lost. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.